Something is happening in the Christian community which concerns me deeply. It is so subtle that many followers of Jesus are missing it. Now, if you've ever read the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, you know the enemy of our souls can be very shrewd and very subtle. This is Brad Bright. Welcome to the God is the Issue podcast, where I show how God is the issue in every issue. I have friends in a lot of ministries around the world. And recently, one friend forwarded me a letter sent out by their ministry to all their non-white staff a few days after the election. After specifically mentioning Donald Trump's victory, it read, "We want to acknowledge the range of feelings that exist right now, no matter who you voted for or didn't vote for what you felt since Tuesday night is valid." Wow. They said, we want to acknowledge the range of feelings that exist right now. I have no problem with that part of the statement. However, the next part, no matter who you voted for, your feelings are valid. Really? Are a person's feelings valid simply because they feel them? Let me ask you, are Louis Farrakhan's feelings about the Jews valid when he implies that they should be exterminated like termites? Were Adolf Hitler's feelings toward Jews, gays, and blacks valid? Were Hillary Clinton's feelings toward deplorables valid? Were the feelings of Southern slaveholders toward blacks valid? Are feelings of lust valid? Jesus said that any man who looks lustfully on a woman has committed adultery. They couldn't possibly be valid unless Jesus lied. Are feelings of hate toward your neighbor valid? Jesus said, love your neighbor. So again, such feelings couldn't possibly be valid unless Jesus is wrong. If all feelings are valid simply because a person feels them, then all the above feelings must be valid as well. How do you think God feels about that? Even a cursory reading of Scripture makes it clear that he does not agree. So if some feelings are clearly not valid, why would the author of the letter assume that all the feelings of all the intended recipients of the letter were valid? Now, my best guess, and as a guess, is that they were trying to validate their own feelings. We've all been guilty of trying to do likewise, but that doesn't validate anything, does it? If they had said that their feelings were real and understandable, I'd agree. But valid? If all my feelings are always valid, doesn't that imply that my feelings are always justifiable and always correct? But I know with certainty that my feelings aren't always justifiable or correct. Only God's feelings are always justifiable or correct. God forbid that I raise my transitory feelings to the level of God's feelings. See, the only logical way I could say that all my feelings are always valid is if God does not exist. See, if God does not exist, then I am the measure of all things because I say so. However, God does exist, then he is the measure of all things. And when my feelings conflict with God's truth and how he feels, my feelings may be real, they may be understandable, but they are not valid. Those are two radically different assertions. Making the all-encompassing statement, your feelings are valid, is just as theologically shallow and naive as saying God just wants you to be happy. See, God knows that until you become holy, you will never be truly happy. Therefore, he wants you to become holy as he is holy. And likewise, God knows your feelings can and will mislead you if you focus on them instead of on him. Our feelings are only valid to the degree to which they reflect God's feelings, God's will, and God's nature. So never confuse the statement that your feelings are real with the statement your feelings are valid or justifiable or correct. When Job cried out to God about how harshly God was treating him, were his feelings real? Yes, they were. Were they understandable? Yes, they were. But were his feelings valid? But what did Job say? See, in the end, he said, I spoke of things I did not understand. Job admitted that he responded emotionally out of ignorance. His emotional response was real. His emotional response was understandable, but his emotional reaction blinded his eyes to the sovereignty and wisdom of God, and that is a huge problem. You remember when God led the Israelites out of Egypt and they arrived at the promised land? They sent 12 spies in to scope out the territory and then report back, right? 10 of those spies said, there are giants in the land. Only 2 of the spies said, God will give us the land. Sadly, the Israelites chose to embrace their fears rather than God's faithfulness. And God made them wander around in the wilderness for 40 years because of it. Was their fear real? Yes, it was. Was their fear understandable? Yes, it was. But did God regard their fear as valid? Well, apparently not. Now, look, it's like when a dad is in the swimming pool and for the first time asks his young son or daughter to jump out into the water so he can catch them. What is generally the child's first reaction? Fear. Is the fear real? Yes, it is. Is the fear understandable? Yes, it is. But is the fear valid? No, it's not. The child is and will be perfectly safe because the dad will catch him or her. That father will not let any harm come to his child. That's how we are with God much of the time, isn't it? God says, I love you, I will take care of you, but we let our fear control us anyway, just like the Israelites did. But God responds, your fear is not valid because I promised to go before you. Last week, I told a story of when Bill Clinton beat George Bush in 1992, winning the White House. I was sitting with my dad in our sunroom when the networks proclaimed Bill Clinton the winner. I could see the pain on my dad's face. He was deeply disappointed. It was not what he had prayed for or hoped for. However, my dad did not focus on his feelings. Instead, he quietly slipped out of his chair, got on his knees, and thanked God by faith that Bill Clinton won. In that moment, my dad was focused on who God is. My dad's feelings were real, but were they valid? Not really. What was valid was the sovereign will and wisdom of God. God saw the big picture, but like Job, my dad did not, and he knew it. So my dad did the only thing a mature follower of Jesus can do in a moment like that. He thanked God by faith for what God had determined was best. Last week, I had mentioned I was ready to get on my knees if Kamala had won, and by faith, thank God that she had won, despite my real feelings, despite my understandable feelings, but not my valid feelings. Why? Because God is sovereign. God is in control. God never says oops. You see, wallowing in my disappointment and fear because I regarded my feelings as valid would be a repudiation of God's sovereignty in that moment. My dad wrote a little evangelistic booklet called The Four Spiritual Laws. You might have heard of it. Towards the end of the booklet, there's a picture of a train, an engine, a coal car, and a caboose. The engine represents fact, that is God and His Word. The coal car represents faith, which is our trust in God and His Word. And the caboose represents feelings. They're usually the last thing to come around to God's perspective, aren't they? What should pull the train and why? The engine or the caboose? God's feelings or our feelings? You see, God's feelings are always valid. Mine and yours, well, they're unreliable, aren't they? They're real, but they're only valid to the degree to which they reflect God's feelings. To say that your feelings are always valid is to say that the caboose should always pull the train, that your feelings are supreme over God's feelings when the two don't align. Jesus said we should love our neighbors. When we don't, is the problem with Jesus' command or with our feelings? Jesus also said we should love God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind. When we don't, is the problem with Jesus' directive or with our emotions? Folks, never assume your feelings are valid until you know they line up with God's feelings. They're real, but that's not the same thing as valid. You see, the goal is to learn to act on what God says is true. If you're a true follower of Jesus, you know that God is sovereign. You know that God never says oops. So when your particular brand of politician doesn't win the race, don't deny your feelings. That's stupid. But instead, embrace God's sovereignty. Embrace God's wisdom by faith. You see, faith pleases God. So don't allow your feelings to drive the train. Don't let your feelings drive you to reject God's sovereignty in that moment. Don't give your feelings greater validity than God's feelings. In moments of disappointment or discouragement or frustration or fear, ask yourself this question. What attribute of God am I struggling to believe is true in this situation? Let me repeat that. What attribute of God am I struggling to believe is true in this situation? Now you've identified your real problem, your view of God. When the doctor told me I was going to die of cancer, I made the decision in that moment to focus on who God was, not on my seemingly hopeless situation, and that has made all the difference. You see, 20 years ago, God began to teach me to ask, do I believe this is a problem, or is it an opportunity to see God work? See, Kathy and I believe every curveball, both big and small, is just another opportunity to see God work. But sometimes it does help us to verbalize the question with each other. Now, as followers of Jesus, we don't have to be distraught when things don't go the way we think they should. Let's face it, compared to God, you and I, we don't know much. God is smarter, God is stronger, God is wiser, God is perfectly just, God is perfectly loving, God's feelings are always right, and God never says, oops. So don't fall for the subtle lie of the enemy that says your feelings are always supreme, your feelings are always valid. It will take your eyes off Jesus every time. And that is exactly what the enemy of your soul wants. So when your feelings start to overwhelm you, fall on your knees like King David did in the Psalms and cling to God's sovereignty, his love, his faithfulness, his wisdom. You see, God is the issue in every issue, even when it comes to our feelings, especially when it comes to our feelings. This is Brad Bright. Thanks for joining me today. If you found this podcast helpful, please like and subscribe. And so when subscribing, don't forget to click on the bell so you'll be notified whenever I publish a new podcast. God bless. And remember, God never says oops. You can stake your emotional health on it.